I'm going to show you the game between Viswanathan Anand and Georg Meier from the Grenke Chess Classic 2019. Remember, if you want to subscribe to the channel, then do click on the button below. It's that simple. And if you'd like to support the channel, help us keep the lights on, then do check out the links in the video description to PayPal or patreon.com. On with this game. So Vishy Anand having a pretty good tournament. He was on 3.5 going into this game. If he won, then he could perhaps keep pace with the leaders. Georg Meier having a rough time. He's a strong player, but he lost that game against Vincent Keimer. So not an easy reward for him to play against the former world champion, our Vishy. So Meier plays his favourite French defence, and this time he goes back to, well, a system that he knows inside out. He did play knight f6 against Peter Svidler earlier on in the tournament, but he goes back to his tried and trusted exchange on e4, and he's played this so many times. I guess the disadvantage of that is that it's easy to prepare against him, but the advantage is that he feels very comfortable, very much at home in this system. You don't see it so often at the highest levels because Black gives ground in the centre, and these guys, they don't like to give away their centre. But of course it's not that clear. Black is going to try to hit out with c5 against White's centre. And, well, I mean, White can develop in various ways against this, and White has very free development as well. But one should not underestimate Black's counter-attacking possibilities. So, bishop g5. Popular move here. Bishop, well, you can play bishop c4, bishop d3. They're all reasonable. Bishop e3 is certainly not a bad idea, and that's kind of directed against c5 actually, but also prepares queenside castling. So we know we're going to get an exciting game. And castles and queen e2. So there we go. Vishy is looking to send the king over here. And this bishop is obviously one of Black's problems. So b6. And puts the bishop on the long diagonal. So that is a beautiful station for the bishop. And with the pawn on b6, then it also prepares the way for c5 as well. Now, Anand and Meier have had this position before in a previous game, and Vishy played c5. Eventually ended in a draw, complicated game, but Vishy now played king b1, which is, well, obviously a very sensible move, just tucking the king out of the way and just seeing how Black sets up before going any further. c5. It's funny, that move feels very, very risky to open the d file when the rook is standing opposite the queen. I know there are a few pieces in the way, but you know, it doesn't take much to get into this situation where suddenly there's this discovered attack on the queen. Of course, in this situation, after pawn takes pawn, Black will play pawn takes pawn, and we can see the point that now the b file opens, and actually the path clears very quickly for Black's queen to come to b6, and after rook b8 there is immediate pressure on b2. White therefore has to be a little bit careful here. And Vishy plays bishop g5, which of course exploits the fact that this bishop is on d6 and not e7. So that's, you know, potentially a little bit irritating for Black, but no problem. Meier played h6, and he's had this position before, a couple of times actually. So trying to clear up the situation. And he had to face h4 before, which probably isn't very good, but he lost the game very quickly, but he will have improvements ready. Vichy just played bishop h4 very quickly. And we're actually following the game between Caruana and Meier from the same tournament in 2017, 2 years ago. Well, there Caruana played c3, and eventually he won that game. It was actually a beautiful game, actually. But, well, again, Meier knows this system very, very well, and, of course, would have had improvements ready. Vichy thought for about 5 minutes and played rook e1. I'm sure he would have had this position on his analysis board before the game. And, well, this move didn't seem to faze Georg Meier. He exchanged on f3 very quickly. And queen takes f3, I think best move. And here, if pawn takes pawn, then rook e4 will collect that pawn, and white is certainly a bit better there. But Meier played a more interesting move, much more interesting move, c4. So the position closes to some extent in the centre, at least the d-file closes, and this pawn can potentially be used for a queenside attack. And here, yeah, Meier plays very bravely actually, advancing his pawn to g5. Now many would be rather fearful of making this move, of course, a pawn move in front of your king, but well, he understands very well it's not so easy to chip away at the king side. And in doing this, well, one thing is he clears this pin, there's no pin anymore, but also he's made sure he's got rid of white's 2 bishops. And here, if pawn takes bishop with the h-pawn, then c3 offers, well, a very dangerous counterplay on the queen side. And the king can happily sit on g7 to protect the h-pawn, and everything is fine. Vichy recapture with the f-pawn, which looks very anti-positional, taking away from the centre, but actually it clears the f-file, so it's possible to get pressure there. And it's certainly the best move. And once again, I think it was possible for Meier to play pawn to c3, just give up a pawn. Although there's no immediate follow-up, I think certainly it would complicate the game, and I don't think black is worse there. But Meier played king g7 after almost a 20-minute think, which is also not a bad move. Of course, it's a very solid move, protecting the knight, protecting the h-pawn, so that means that the queen can move away. It doesn't have to keep protecting the knight on f6. So there's potential for c3 to come, and this would be even better, because then the queen would be able to move into action straight away, because the knight is now protected. So Anand blocked with c3. Very understandable move. The problem is that now black plays b5, and there is counterplay coming. Black threatens to break open the queen side with b4. So this is a very tense situation. And maybe Vichy's best is to play the rook to f1 with some pressure here. So after this exchange, and then queen d6, and now d5. I think the most likely scenario here is that there are going to be a lot of exchanges in the middle of the board, and probably ending up in a draw. But we have g4 from Vichy instead, which, yeah, potentially very dangerous, as there's potential to open up the king side. We'll see how on this next turn. Meier thought for almost 20 minutes over this move, queen d6, and I'm sure that in playing this move he was calculating h4, and I'm sure Vichy spent a long time looking at this as well. He spent over 15 minutes on this decision. Now Vichy went for rook f1 here, but let's have a quick look at h4, which starts to loosen black's position. Obviously an exchange here would mean that the g-pawn would be a little bit vulnerable. So black has to take. Now the position isn't opening up quite yet, but white can achieve that with this funny move, bishop b7. That clears the e-file, and then rook e5. So white just wants to play g5 and crack open the position. And this is really double-edged. Here, black has to be very brave and start to create counterplay on the queenside himself. And after g5, the knight goes back, can go back to e8 or d7. And after the taking on h6, the king just nudges to the side. This is completely unclear. Very, very double-edged situation with black's king a little bit insecure here, but finding some safety, and the b-file breaking open as well. I have a feeling that Vichy considered this in some detail, but couldn't find a clear way through, and probably it was just a bit messy for him. That's not really his style. If he goes in for complications, he likes to make sure that somehow they're favourable to him. And I guess he couldn't determine whether this was good for white or not, and therefore backed off and played something different. So in this position, he wanted a cleaner situation and played instead rook f1, attacking the knight on f6. Which is not a bad move. And Meier exchanged and now bravely took on h2. Well, in some ways it's a sensible defensive move because it rules out the possibility of pawn to h4. But of course, sending your queen offside for a moment is potentially dangerous, but it's a strong move actually. And here Vichy could play queen f3, which would mean that Meier would probably have to just return the pawn, and this is probably equal. And black is perhaps slightly better because these pawns aren't very good, but I can't imagine this would be anything but a draw. And I'm sure Vichy realised that, but he played d5. Breaking open the position, so trying to keep more tension. The queen came back to cover this pawn, so that after pawn takes pawn, he can just recapture. Check. And now things start to get a bit wild again. Queen takes pawn, so Vichy has managed to inject some imbalance in the position. He could perhaps hope to win this. But Meier played excellently. I mean, there are a couple of things he could do. He could push the b-pawn straight away. The queen would probably come back. He played rook c5. I think it's a very interesting decision, shutting out white's queen from the king side. So a very practical move. And of course, attacking the pawn as well. Queen b7. Good move from Vichy. But now things start to get very messy with the advance of this e-pawn. Rook f5 protects this one, so that means that potentially the rook can come across to deal with the e-pawn. e3, king c1. With white's king a little bit exposed here, it is quite a dangerous situation for white. Black's king actually, in spite of this advanced g5, actually looks more secure. And now an excellent move from Meier. b4. This is a very confusing move for white, actually. There's lots of potential to go wrong. So, for example, after pawn takes pawn, the rook comes back. The queen has to move. And then here's a nice move, rook fc8. Now that protects this pawn. So, I mean, potentially that black can advance with c3, but also means the rook can now shift across because the pawn is protected by the second rook. The rook can go to e7 to support the e-pawn, and that is very dangerous for white. I think you can see that with the queen well away from white's rooks, dare I say it, not just split rooks but split major pieces. The white queen is way offside, and black's coordination, well, you know, every picture tells a story. Black is doing extremely well there. So that would be pawn takes pawn. Best move is probably rook f1, attacking f7. Coordination, I might add. And the game would probably, best play is probably just to end in a draw here. The white queen is shut out, but it can make a nuisance of itself like this. And I think that's a reasonable continuation for both sides, repeating the position with a draw. But after b4, Vishy did not play that. He took on b4. And now rook b8 and rook b5. So you can see the queen is still out of the action. And this terrible threat to take on b2. Queen a7, attacking the f7 pawn. Rook b7, and the queen came back to take on e3. But then rook b2. And, sorry, rook b2 here. So you can see the rooks have broken through. It's still a pretty unclear situation because, you know, that's a potentially dangerous passed pawn. Vishy correctly exchanged queens here, but he's worse. He was looking for salvation with this passed d pawn, but, you know, watch out for the attack with the rooks. d6 is possible, but then rook takes pawn. It's extremely dangerous. Not necessarily lost yet, but black is obviously in the driving seat. Rook d4. Check. And now here is where Vishy made a fatal error. He should come back with the rook. And black is better here. But white is not yet lost. So let's come back to this situation. Rook g1, check, just played. Vishy stepped up with the king. And now the trap shuts with rook b1. And here the former world champion resigned. Threat, rook b2, checkmate. If rook takes pawn, it's really surprising. But black manages to win a rook here. Let's just follow what happens. Here, rook d1 check. The king, well, a couple of possibilities. King e3, we check. The king protects the rook here. But then rook d2 check forces the king away, and with an extra rook that is completely winning. Or if we go back to that position here after the check, then if king e4 and the king goes to f5, then this actually ends up in a checkmate here. It's very surprising how the king is caught. And what else have we got? After, yes, this move, rook b1, king d2, again this loses to this, and the rook on e5 drops here. So rook b1, final move of the game, and Vishy resigned. I thought it was a really interesting struggle. This tension between the play in the centre and play on the queenside, and Meier balanced it extremely well and played some very brave moves. Queen takes h2, and then this move b4 just kind of upset Vishy there. So I'm very pleased for Georg Meier, who's been having a rough tournament, but he hits back. He is a strong player. He's still, right there at the bottom of the table with Vincent Keimer. They both have 2 out of 7. For Vishy, that was a bad day at the office. We know he can play much better than that. So he's still on 3.5 on 50%. Magnus Carlsen won. He beat Aronian very, very easily in round 7. Aronian just collapsed, actually. So Magnus Carlsen still in the lead with 5.5. Caruana beat Naidic and is a point behind him on 4.5. So still 2 games to go. Critical round. Carlsen has black against Svidler and Caruana has black against Meier. So we could be in for an interesting last couple of rounds. Thanks for watching.